You're now listening to the third installment of Felix firing off from afar for the flyover. And today I'm going to talk to you about the second job that I took. And I almost didn't take it because there is a policy that employees cannot have beards. First, that's the epitome or even caricature of top-down, democracy-free, authoritarian workplace control. So I almost turned it down for that reason, which brings me to my first point. That is, being able to do that, to turn down a job like that, or having that option, even though it might hurt, exemplifies a kind of relative privilege. And that relative privilege can immensely empower some over others, to be sure, comes as a result of a whole legacy of domination. White privilege and male privilege rest upon a whole history of slavery, institutionalized racism, variations of Jim Crow, and multifaceted manifestations of patriarchy and really violence against women. And many of these forms of domination are, of course, wrapped up historically and into the present with defining systemic social relations, like those that have reproduced capital for some time now, and with all the economic exploitation that generates and relies upon. But the discourse of privilege, the way it is invoked within institutions that are rife with it, like the university, well, that's when it can assume certain insidious ideological functions. So, while I might no doubt benefit from white privilege, male privilege, even the privilege of a background within a sector of the working class enjoying something a little more than complete abject poverty, for example, that privilege has to be contextualized and shouldn't be used to evade the issue of the exploitation me and countless others really are subjected to, although privilege is discussed within the university in terms primarily of identity politics, which might be acceptable, even though I think those discussions are important, but they're acceptable because it enables this sort of conscience-allaying admission of some guilt, perhaps, in the university's better paid professorial class analyses of privilege tend to erase then underlying class issues, serious wealth disparities, and criticism of capitalism generally, that is, structural critique that actually would inform criticism of those other relations of domination. And so this favored mode of critique of certain types of privilege perhaps then functions to allay some professorial class guilt without actually clarifying the root of much structural oppression, or at least the interrelations among different modes of oppression, let alone leading to any action against it. But despite the option some relative privilege afforded me, in that case I was describing to you, being able to turn down a second job and perhaps scrape by doing something else, borrowing money, what have you, that privilege in this case wasn't great enough and had other reasons, so I ended up taking the job. So maybe there are prospects, I was hoping, for doing something within the workplace that reduces the kind of privilege that is capitalist class power and near poverty for the other people who work, doing something to contest that. And so I also want to challenge, in turn, the notion popular among some autonomous factions of radical politics, the notion of accepting abysmal work and then scraping by, trying to acquire just enough to then focus on creating alternatives elsewhere, which only really, for the most part, materialize in part and involve only a sliver of the population. Now, I don't want to have this interpreted as saying that I don't think those alternative constructions are unimportant. In fact, I think they're immensely important. But just hear me out. So I think that the dismissal of contestatory politics within the workplace is problematic for reasons that I'm going to enumerate below. And I also, in turn, want to critique, I guess, what is a common anti-authoritarian criticism of movement building. And so I am in agreement, just to clarify, with the criticism that movement building often has the implications of appealing to existing structures of power and authority and just imploring them to be nicer, or pressuring them at best, but not actually working to dissolve or displace those relations, those hierarchical social relations, which I think is what's needed. And so that's not the only option when we're talking about movements, if we want to use that term. And so there's another critique of movement building that would suggest, well, let's just start building now. We don't need a movement to do that. But then questions naturally arise. Start building that alternative with what? With who are we going to rely upon? And so if the overwhelming majority of people are still working awful jobs, you're not going to be able to meaningfully create or prefigure much of anything better, or at least you're not going to be able to do that with the same kind of power and potency that you might if those who are being dehumanized within capitalistic workplaces were actually on board with the kinds of projects that you're trying to create. And I think there's certain ways that are best suited to actually getting people excited about that. So conversely, what is lost in those cases that I described is that actually organizing and doing things that are truly empowering for people, challenging bosses and private dictatorial control over productive property, that can be truly transformative. So demanding, or better, enacting without asking, democracy in the workplace is admittedly exceptionally difficult, but it's absolutely transformative, I think. And here's why. So it's difficult because there's an incredibly thick ideological fog that masks relations of power and obscures the actual antagonisms and institutional violence of capital at work, with at work intended as a double entendre there. So, just to be clear, this is not to reduce all human desire or doing to a Nietzschean sort of will to power, or to imply a pervasive multiplicity of power relations so diverse or ubiquitous that a particularly pivotal mode of power, like ownership or control over workplace and decision-making leverage within it, do not exist. They do. That's what Félix has been firing off about. And I'm also not accepting the premise, for example, that Michel Foucault advanced in his 1971 debate with Noam Chomsky, that the proletariat in this hypothetical scenario wages war with the ruling class not because it considers changing the established order to be just, but because, as Foucault claimed, it wants to take power, and therefore, I can quote, consider such a war to be just. Except, no. Ideas about a more just society, and similarly anarchist critiques of hierarchy and domination and the importance placed upon mutual aid, these are not just ideological instruments for or against power. I can't even convey how reductive that is. It's almost as reductive as capitalism is as regards human social relations. Capitalism simplifies them to the extent possible into commodity form. It's the hegemony of exchange value. That's gross, and it's almost just as gross to think about human wants and desires in terms of instincts for power over specifically, which is what Foucault was implying in that debate. So now, what gets a little closer to reality and is more consonant with an anti-authoritarian, anti-capitalist politics, at least the kind that I'm excited about, would be thinking through how to mutually empower. That is, how to cultivate people's capacities to exercise agency together, intervene in the world, and make the decisions that affect them, instead of someone else being able to do that, as was the case with what I described. To return to my point from before, it's incredibly difficult to democratize work because even though power relations are so thoroughly inscribed in the workplace, and even though those relations result in all sorts of anger and frustration among people, they are still, at least on some level, those relations invisibilized, rendered opaque, or made to seem natural, as though they were just individual problems, not structurally connected. This is why the work of someone like Wayne Price, who wrote The Value of Radical Theory, an anarchist introduction to Marx's critique of political economy, is so important. And you can actually access reading aloud sessions of Wayne Price's book at the Flyover InfoShop website, flyoverinfoshop.org. There are reading discussion sessions of Flyover Collective members where Price's book was read aloud and discussed very thoroughly. And I suggest checking that out. But in the book and elsewhere in his writing, Price explains the Marxian labor theory of value, which is what is actually demonstrated when shop floor dissent is translated into attempts at democratic reorganization. That is, it reveals exploitation. And exploitation is not just feeling mistreated or overworked, although usually when you feel that way, you are exploited, and although people are both of those pretty much all the time, but in large part that's because when you work for a wage within capitalism, that is exploitation by definition. Radicals sometimes forget this or don't emphasize it enough, or there aren't as many concerted efforts to explain it anymore. So even though you might not feel like you're being exploited within capitalism when you're performing abstract labor for a wage, you still are, and it probably has all sorts of other negative, dehumanizing effects we're seldom conscious of or think about. So it's great to stand up to bosses and owners when you really feel exploited, when it's quite abundantly clear that what they're doing is exercising power over you and making you feel very disempowered. So in those cases, it's great to stand up. It's those pinpointable issues that can really ignite this whole fire I've been firing off about. But realize the issue of the power relations in the workplace and the power relations of capital that circumscribe what goes on in the workplace are always already exploiting you immensely. Some more than others, and some within that the processes of exploitation are also arguably dehumanized more than others and also disempowered more than others. So it's worth pointing that out. But resisting that exploitation to varying degrees begins to reveal the locus of that exploitation, collectively arriving at the decision to act in the workplace in ways that gives everyone within it or affected by it a say over things, perhaps in proportion to the degree they are affected. That's one idea about what democracy is. Foregrounds at least the idea of doing things differently and throws a wrench in the incessant disimagination machine. And the more that idea is materialized as a process and reworked through relations of power to, not power over, the more we transform ourselves and the world that mediates us in the process. So this has been Felix firing off from afar for the flyover, and I'll be back with my fourth installment next time.